conversation as we entered week 3 of the lockdown, and the government now strongly considers extending the lockdown for 2 more weeks. Several states have already made that announcement, and we're awaiting the Prime Minister's confirmation on a nationwide extension. Scientists now believe that they see a slight but a noticeable flattening of the curve starting the 6th of April. And this is a report coming out of the Indian Institute of Mathematical Sciences in Chennai. I have with me in this conversation Professor Sitabhra Sinha, who is one of the authors of this particular report. Professor Sinha, good evening, and thank you for joining me on Truth Be Told here on Boom Live. I want to understand. I want to understand from you. You believe that there has been a flattening. Could you tell us exactly what these numbers mean?
Sure. So, an epidemic is essentially characterized by an exponential growth in the number of active cases. I mean, that's when you call, a certain phenomenon an epidemic. So, the first thing that usually an epidemiologist does when faced with what could turn out to be a pandemic is to try to see what is the rate of growth of the number of active cases over time and see if this actually follows an exponential growth curve. And the next order of business is to try to measure this rate of growth. So this is what the press has been talking about a lot, the so-called R0, the basic reproduction number. Put very simply, it's just the average number of people that a single infected person infects over the duration that he or she is infected. Yes. So needless to say, the higher this number is, the faster the disease will spread. It's a kind of a measure of the contagiousness of the disease. Now, this value of R0 turns out to be, spanning quite a spectrum for COVID-19 when it's measured across the different regions where breakout has been observed. So, for example, we have values as high as something close to 4 for Denmark, for example. And in other places like Japan, in the initial phase of the outbreak, for example, it was just slightly greater than 1. So it was very interesting to, for example, when it first broke out in India, to try to measure this R0 to see where exactly India lies on this spectrum. And what we find is that at least from the period from March 4th onwards, the reason why March 4th is important is that's when the number of cases got to double digits. Earlier, we just had, like 1 or 2 cases in Kerala, for example. So on March 4th, we had this group of Italian tourists in a hotel in South Delhi who tested positive, and also this family of 6 in Agra who tested positive. So suddenly we had 23 new cases. So from March 4th onwards, we can say that the epidemic kind of found a toehold in India. And if you measure the growth of the number of active cases from that date onwards, we find that it does follow an exponential curve with a very characteristic growth rate quite well. I mean, the numbers kind of fluctuate a bit about the fitted curve, but overall the fit is remarkable. And this corresponds to R0 of about 1.8. So what it means is that typically, or on average, every infected person is infecting about 1.8 other people. Now, that seems like a small number, but going ahead, this can actually quickly lead to a very large increase. I mean, just imagine, if every infected person infects 2 others, then those 2 will infect 4 others, those 4 would infect 8, and so on, like 16, 32. We quickly have an exponential rise. So it's better for us if this number is as small as possible. So what we find is that from March 4th until April 5th, we have essentially all these cases falling on roughly a single curve corresponding to this R0 of 1.83. And then from April 6th onwards, we see a slight deviation. Now, for the first few days, like April 6th, 7th, 8th, and so on, correct.
Yes.
we couldn't be very sure that this is a genuine trend because there are fluctuations. So we had to wait for about 6 days before we were confident that this looked like a sustained trend. And
Yes.
so
So if I may, Professor, if I may just show the audience this, and I want to ask the audience's indulgence and forgiveness for the poor production quality because we're all working from home. So I have a printout to show you, and I believe this is the data that the professor and his team have put out. So if I'm not mistaken, we're looking at this is the 4th of March, which is that point where we hit double digit in India. This is the 5th of April. And if I pull that a little closer to the camera, that's the range that you're looking at. So the really spiky curve here is what it would have been projected without a lockdown. And the slightly weaker curve is what you project if things continue the way they are continuing right now, and you believe that could be because of the lockdown. Is that correct?
that's correct. So what we find is that from 6th onwards until yesterday, that's 12th. So for this 1 week worth of data, if we analyze, it seems to be systematically following a different trend. And this corresponds to an effective reproduction number of close to 1.5. Technically, it's 1.53. Now, between 1.83 and 1.53, it's like a difference of 0.3. Now, people might say, well, that's not an appreciable change. But, as I said, it makes a huge difference if you go forward and if you start multiplying this over and over again. So, for example, starting from today, if we project this trend up to the 20th of April, we would say that typically we would get about 20,000 active cases on 20th. If we had continued on the earlier trend, that's the trend that we had seen from March 4th onwards, then on April 20th, we would have seen around 35,000 cases. Now, that's like, double that number, right? So just projecting a few days ahead, you can see that this very small difference of about 0.3 in the reproduction number can make a difference of about 15,000 in the number of active cases. And this difference will become even starker as we go forward.
So allow me to offer some rebuttals from some other reports that have come out. One of the things that keeps coming up is that we're not testing enough. And as a result, now obviously when you're doing research like this, that you can only go with the numbers that have officially been released. And we won't know unless we test more. What is your response to that?
I absolutely agree that this has to be taken with some amount of what do you call a pinch of salt or a lot of salt. So you can only talk about what you see in the data. From the data, it seems like there is a consistent trend. Now, regarding this lack of testing, now it's true that if you have a lot more tests done, you'd have a lot more confidence in the numbers that you report.
Yes.
But I would also point out that that by itself does not disqualify the trend that we are reporting for the following reason. So suppose you didn't test enough, what you will be missing out are people at the early stages of the disease. But once they have a full-blown disease, it's very hard to hide it, because they would have to go to the hospital. And so this would be reflected, for example, by a sudden spike in the curve that we are drawing. The fact that we don't see such sudden spikes seem to tell us that whatever we are missing by this lack of extensive testing is not enough to suggest that the curve is actually completely different. What we might be missing, what we might be missing is, of course, the asymptomatic cases, right?
Yes.
And that is something that we have as yet no clue, because there are studies from Iceland, for example, which are claiming that it could be as large as 50% of the people infected who could be asymptomatic. There are other studies which actually quote a smaller number. There are other studies which say that asymptomatic people are not able to infect as effectively as people who are symptomatic. So this is truly an unknown. So we have no clue. Okay, I can only go with the numbers we have.
Yes, that I do want to ask you is, and this was part of your own research report where you did say that the true impact of the lockdown will only be seen in the number of increases after 2 weeks. which means
Yes.
starting about now. So
Yeah.
effectively, that would mean that everyone who's infected is either in quarantine or in their homes and is unable to give it to other people, assuming full compliance, which again,
Yes.
we must accept we haven't had in the country. So you are putting it out there that this is a little soon to be drawing this conclusion.
Not really. So, if you consider the fact that starting from the Janata curfew, which I think occurred around 21st or so,
Yes.
uh, till the 6th, it's already about a period of 2 weeks. So already starting from Janata curfew, there were, you know, constraints which had been put in place. So I was expecting, maybe not on 6th, but definitely around 8th or 9th, probably the beginning of a trend. So I'm not too surprised by seeing it starting on 6th. Now, as regards the compliance issue, yes, if there had been total compliance, I would have expected a lot sharper change. The fact
Yes.
that we see a change only from 1.83 to 1.53 or whatever
Hmm.
suggests that although to some extent effective, the compliance has, of course, not been, what we would have expected in an ideal setting.
Yes. I do want to ask you, there's a second chart. Would you be able to explain to our audience what this chart says and why it's different from the curve in the previous chart?
Sure. So this is actually the same data that I've shown in the earlier figure. The only
Mm-hmm.
difference is that now the vertical axis is being shown in what is called a logarithmic scale. In other words, I'm showing the interval from 10 to 100,
Mm.
the interval from 100 to 1000, and the interval from 1000 to 10,000 using the same gaps. The reason why I do this is because an exponential growth curve in when plotted on such a graph paper essentially manifests as a straight line. So this is
Mm.
just to show that when I say that the number of cases has been growing as an exponential curve, it's something that's easily visualized using a graph of this kind. So you would see that the same data which was appearing
Mm.
like a curve going up essentially now appears as a straight line. And you can
Yes.
see that despite the small little wiggles, it actually falls almost for the entire range within that bound, which is given by the pinkish interval around the red broken curve, indicating that despite the small fluctuations, the exponential growth curve with that characteristic rate of
Yeah.
1.83 had been consistently followed from March 4th onwards.
Right. I also want to ask you one last question, if I may. In the previous chart that you did show us, so the shaded area, from what I understand from the report, is the possible variance or in that
Yes.
projection. The variance is rather wide, Professor.
Yeah. So that's because, when we do this estimation of the R naught, there is, of course, some errors in this estimation. Okay?
Hmm.
Because in real world, of course, there's a lot of fluctuation, and there might be, certain fluctuations might be actually identified as a genuine trend. And so we always quote what could be the errors. And so, for example, when I say R naught, I always say that it's 1.83 plus minus 0.03. Now, that seems like a very small error, but again, the power of exponential multiplication kicks in. And so going forward, this error becomes larger and larger and larger. And so that's why, I said that in the typical case, we would expect something like 20,000 if this trend continues. But in the worst case, we could have, something close to 30,000. That's because that's what is given by the upper bound of our error estimates.
So I'm going to put you in a slightly difficult position for the mathematician, but let's assume after the added 2 weeks of extension, on the 1st of May, where do you see these curves, assuming that we continue at 1.55, which means a lower rate of transmission? Do you expect that we would be in a position to end the lockdown, or do you think we'll, be at a slower pace of transmission?
Well, given that it's only 1.55 or 1.53, I don't think simply extending the lockdown would be enough to, get us out of trouble. Uh,
Mhm.
what it's doing is simply buying us time. What we do with that time is, of course, very important. Do we allow for, more testing within the community? Do we have better methods of surveillance where so that we can identify symptomatics faster and isolate them from the population? Do we manage to, somehow come up with, some other measure, like, tell people to comply with this kinds of social distancing in a better way? Or, and that's a complete unknown, can the Indian summer actually, act as our savior? Because there are some quarters which are saying that the virus could be affected by high humidity levels, and the rate at which the probability of the transmission of the pathogen from one individual to another could actually decrease, at high
Well,
levels
actually,
of
to be
humidity.
fair, Professor, we don't have any conclusive evidence to the fact that humidity or high temperatures could in any way slow down the transmission of this.
There is no conclusive evidence, but the reason why I'm saying this is that there is some suggestion that the airborne droplets, which could actually, cause the pathogen to spread very easily from one individual to another. Like you sneeze and then these droplets are suspended in the air, and it will take them some time to finally, go down to the sink to the ground. And so what happens during high humidity, periods is that these droplets essentially become heavier quickly and they fall to the ground faster. And so, therefore, the airborne load of pathogens could actually come down in high humidity situations. So that could be a possible explanation. I'm just,
Yeah,
telling like what.
we don't know. I mean, I've done some research and we don't know yet if that's actually conclusive. So I just want to put that out there, also about it being airborne as well. But coming back to your research, you did say, and different states are now behaving differently. So Maharashtra, for example, is showing an exponential rise. Delhi is at a 1,100 cases as well. So it will also depend on how each state manages to handle the transmission within the state.
Yeah, that's true. So, Maharashtra, as I said, is somewhat alarming because so far we don't see any evidence of slowing down of the growth rate. It's continuing more or less on the same growth curve it has been from the beginning, and which is actually somewhat higher than the national average. On the other hand, Telangana, for example, seems to be showing exactly the same kind of trend, that is somewhat of a slowing down of the growth rate from sixth onwards. Uh, Delhi is also showing a slight tapering off, although it has a lot more fluctuations than the other regions that we have been studying. Tamil Nadu and Kerala are kind of exceptions because they don't seem to be following this exponential curve at all. On the other hand, they seem to be showing a linear growth trend, which is unusual for an epidemic, actually. For Kerala, I might well believe that that could be signaling the effectiveness of the containment measures.
Right. Professor Sinha, thank you for speaking with me here on Boom Live and sharing your research with us. So, Professor Sinha of the Institute of Mathematical Sciences of Chennai, pointing out in this research report that he has noticed a noticeable flattening of the curve, even though it is a slight flattening, a noticeable flattening. Professor Sinha, thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you.